let's get started. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the webinar with MoEngage and OLX. It's absolutely great to have all of you here. My name is Ashwin. I oversee marketing at MoEngage. All right, excellent. So we've got an excellent topic ahead of us, and we've got Olive Sen, who is from OLX. OLX needs no introduction. I'm pretty sure all of you have heard of OLX and know about what they do. But let's welcome Olive. Olive, hey, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Hey, Ashwin, thanks for inviting me to speak on this topic. And hello to everyone. Thanks for being here. Looking forward to the session and sharing, a little about myself. So I'm currently heading strategy and growth for OLX India. I work in the cross section of marketing, product, data, and that's what I've been doing for the last almost close to 5 years at OLX. So I have currently, what I'll be sharing is very close to what I had been working on in the last 1 year, and a lot of interesting things we did at OLX, and happy to share some of my learnings over the past 1 year.
Awesome, awesome. So Olive, you mentioned that you work at the cross section of product, marketing, and data, right? I mean, that's a very interesting cross section. So what are some of the things that you're responsible for? What do you do on a daily basis?
So primarily, so it's right now. I mean, of course, the key business requirement that we have is to grow the user base of OLX in India, which is we already have a significant penetration, but we are looking at growing our penetration even further to even as we call it in the industry, to the next billion users. So a lot of performance marketing, a lot of growth initiatives targeting users, user acquisition, user retention, how we can improve those metrics, how we can improve the cost of acquisition, and drive ROI for the businesses. So looking at all those data and looking at some of the initiatives across the different verticals for OLX, I think that's what I really do, hands-on.
Awesome, awesome. Sounds like an interesting role. We've got a topic called acquisition versus retention today. But Olive, can you kind of give a sense of what the audience can expect out of today's conversation? What are you going to cover, and any key takeaways that the audience can have?
Absolutely. So what we're going to talk about today is, I mean, all of us know primarily what acquisition is and what primarily retention is, especially in the mobile first world. But interestingly, what we will be looking at today is, how do we balance that, between acquisition and retention, and trying to quantify the impact financially that, if you overlook one over the other, there are consequences. So we'll look at a few examples and try to assess. So we'll be looking at, app retention numbers. We're looking at app acquisition metrics and see how that influences the overall traffic growth on the platform. So in the app world, that's like the DAU, right? So the daily active user. So we'll be looking at how acquisition and retention influences the DAU for, we'll take some practical examples. We'll talk about it, maybe across different apps, and we'll see how these numbers actually influence the end metric, which is the traffic on the platform, or DAU as we call it. So we're looking at the cost efficiencies as well. So we'll get a hang of how these numbers are so interdependent with each other and influences one over the other. So so as a marketer or as somebody who's taking care of the overall growth initiative, it's very important to be on top of both acquisition as well as retention, and drive those metrics in the right direction, so that it influences the overall business in a very positive way.
Awesome. So yeah, that's great. I mean, I always love when there's real life examples and actual actionable takeaways. So hey, thanks, Olive. I think that's great. And then we're going to jump deep into the topic itself. Awesome. So I think, Olive mentioned that he's going to start with an example. So it's not going to be at a very high level or a 50,000 feet level. So this is real, practical, actionable insights, folks. So Olive, over to you. So what do you mean when you say you want to take an example?
Sure, guys. So let me, so if we can just move on to the next slide. So let's, consider 5 apps. So I think some of us might have already, we see this kind of graph for an app retention. So what does this mean? So, right from the day of install, this actually tracks the user activity, over some, let's say 30-day period. I mean, this number can go on beyond 30 days, but let's just look at maybe a fixed window. So let's say, let's talk about any particular category that we're talking about. Maybe this is fashion, maybe this is e-com, so whatever the industry be. You'll see that, of course, like, what we know in the industry, for example, so apps which are more engagement driven. So like social media apps typically have higher engagement rates than typically the e-commerce apps. But even within the same category, what we see, the different apps tend to have somewhat different retention numbers. So let's consider that, one particular category. It could be anything, like it could be fashion, it could be e-com, whatever it is. And let's say that, there's a B, C, and D and E. So these 5 apps, they have very different 30-day retention. So which means that, on the 30th day after installing the app, only, let's say for the app E, the 6% of people only come back to the platform, and whereas for app D, this number is 16%. So we all know that higher the retention, it's better. But let's see actually how does it influence us in the real world and financially. So moving on, yeah. So I talked about user activity, right? So after 30 days, for each of these apps, let's say all of these apps have 100,000 users daily downloading the app. But with these retention numbers which we saw in the last graph, this is how the DAU will stack after 30 days. So which means, let's say the app D, which had a very high retention of around 16%, we see that the DAU numbers have stacked up to almost 800,000, whereas for the app E, we know that it's around 6%. So with that kind of a retention, the number is like almost half of what app D is. That is between D and E. Even when we look at some of the, between A, B, or between C and E, so the difference in retention is like it's 7%, 10%, and 6%. But just see the variance which in DAUs or the traffic that it creates. So even that 1 or 2% points in retention actually, affects your overall traffic so significantly. So this is how the DAU numbers look like. Now, let's say the app D is the market leader, and you are taking care of growth for some of the other apps, which is let's say the app A or app B or D, C, and E, and you need to compete with the market leader, which is D. So so how do you go about it? Like you have to increase the traffic. So either there are 2 ways, right? So one, you acquire more users every day. So you accelerate on the acquisition channel, or you work on the retention part of it. So fundamentally, these are the 2 ways in which you can increase the platform, the traffic on the platform.
That's interesting. Sorry.
Yeah. So that's so maybe we can move on to the next slide.
Yep, absolutely. I think that's really interesting, right? So when you look at these numbers, so app D is clearly the market leader. And if you are a marketing manager or an app owner or a product owner at one of the other apps, you really want to think about how we want to catch up with D. So let's assume that we keep the retention rate constant, right? So let's assume that you don't improve the retention rate and you just improve, and that you just focus all your efforts on kind of getting more users, so that we can kind of do a comparison which tells us that, look, if you don't improve your retention rate, what is the financial impact, right? So yeah, Olive, I think this captures this very well.
That's the crux of it, right? So like what Ashwin you mentioned. So when you so typically, at the end of the day, in terms of the business pressure that we tend to have, what we end up doing is, we put on the acceleration pedal on acquisition. And so let's say, let's take a real life example, and let's say we are in that situation when, for example, Ashwin is taking care of app A, and let's say I'm taking care of app E, and we all have to reach where app D already is. So and we decide that we need to increase the acquisition rate, the number of daily app installs on the platform. So so what will end up happening is, to reach the same level as app D, so we need, so for the app E, which had 6% retention level and 100,000 sort of daily downloads, that 100,000 number now has to go to almost double, which is like 182,000 daily, so that the DAUs are in the same range as app D. Whereas app D, which has a much higher retention, it can sustain itself at the same DAU level even with a lower acquisition rate. So that's the power of retention. And next slide, we'll also see that to keep on that kind of a paid acquisition rate every day, what is the financial impact? So and sometimes that can be really massive, and it can really upset the overall the financials for the marketing team or for the company for so
Got it.
yeah.
So I think, Olive, so just a quick question here, just to make sure that everybody understands this. Um, so essentially, when we started off, we assumed that all the apps were seeing about 100,000 downloads organically, correct?
That's correct, yeah.
Okay. So here we are trying to say that assuming that all the apps were seeing 100,000 downloads organically, what's the additional users that the apps need to acquire to be at the same DAU rate of around around 8.5 or around 850,000, right? So
Yeah,
app B clearly does not need to acquire any additional users, whereas app A needs to acquire an additional 60,000, app B needs to acquire 22,000, C needs to acquire 75,000, and E needs to acquire 82,000.
that's correct, yeah.
Got it.
So
Okay.
so these are the daily incremental app downloads or app installs. These individual apps, will need to drive in order to reach the same DAU level as the app D. And app D can achieve that without with any incremental acquisition. So, like with not even spending any dollar, they will be at the same level.
Got it. Got it. So in the next slide, I think all of you are going to assume that all of these delta is acquired through paid channels, right?
Yeah, that's correct. So typically, when we need to sort of acquire more users, so I mean, of course, so performance marketing, or it could be somewhat brand marketing, performance marketing, but essentially you'll end up spending money somewhere, right? So for simplicity, let's assume that we are looking at performance marketing right now, and which means that in the performance world, we all know that what is the cost per install. So that's what is the 7-day retention. So these are the kind of metrics that you end up monitoring or measuring. So we'll talk about that a little bit, and then we'll see what is the financial impact between the different apps, and what kind of monies that they need to burn. So so I think just to illustrate it to everybody the point, I think Ashwin clearly explained that. So so for the different apps, the organic installs are, let's say, at a level of 100,000 daily. So and we talked about that, if you have to reach a certain DAU number after 30 days, we need to drive different levels of paid installs. So we can clearly see that app D doesn't need to drive any paid installs for that matter, which means its retention rates are so fantastic that no additional dollar need to be spent to achieve that level. But for the different other apps, that A, B, C, and E, we need to spend money to be able to reach that level. So before we move on to that, so I think the other interesting thing what happens is the cost per install is also dependent on the level of spends at which you're operating. So which means that there is an elasticity. So the more you spend, the more the cost per install goes up. So let's say if you're spending $1,000 a day, you could have a cost of per install for your category to be at, I don't know, 5 cents, 10 cents, 15 cents. But as you start spending more and more every day, so let's say you start moving from $1,000 to $5,000, $10,000, and beyond that, could be spending more for bigger sort of DAU targets, or for a big business, you could be spending and then ending up spending $100,000 daily also. So depending on the size of the business at which you're operating, even for the particular category that you are in, you will see a elasticity going up, which means that for every incremental dollar that you spend, the cost of install sort of increases over a period of time. And why does that happen? Because at the end of the day, so there is always there's some users, some people who are already very, has a strong affinity for your particular app or your particular product. Then there are people who know relatively less about you, so you need to target them more, you need to spend more money on them to acquire those users. So if you look at the numbers, let's say 60,000, so for app A we need to drive 60,000 installs, and the CPI, so these are hypothetical numbers, so let's say it's around 30 cents. For app B, which is roughly, let's say, 1/3 of app A in terms of the paid installs, is daily paid installs. The ECPI also, could be somewhere, the relationship is not linear, but it could be somewhere between half and 1/3. App C, which is, again, needs to drive even more installs than app A, which is 75,000 versus 60,000 for app A. You will see that the CPI numbers have, further gone up, so 37 cents. And lastly, for app E, which needs to drive 82,000 paid installs, this number can really go up. So let's say, for simplicity, let's say we've assumed that it's 0.42. Basis some experiments that we have done, we've seen that this is the number that we will operate at. And now we'll just look at the financial impact. So app E, if it spends 42 cents for every paid install and on an average, and it needs to drive 82,000 daily, so 82,000 multiplied by 0.42 multiplied by 30 days, which is the monthly spend, this number is massive. It's $1 million. And let's just look at the the other apps. So D, we know that we don't need to spend money, so D is safe. C, app C, okay, so app C also needs to drive a lot of paid installs. 75,000 multiplied by 37, $832,000, which is still significant. App B is in a good situation. So app B is not, app B probably has a retention rate which is not as high as app D, which is 10%. But just look at the kind of marketing spends that it will operate at is much lower. So 22,000 multiplied by 12 cents multiplied by 30 days is $79,000. So the point is, so let's just look at this between B and C. So B has a retention of 10% and C has a retention of 6% after 30 days. So it's only the 3-4 marginal points in terms of retention percentage points. But just look at the financial impact. The financial impact is massive. So app C will end up spending almost close to $700,000 plus more every month than app B. And so driving those incremental percentage points in 1-2 percentage points in retention can have such a huge financial impact that that's just crazy in terms of the impact you can do to your business. And that's been a fantastic learning for me last year. I mean, this financial year for OLX, and we kind of worked very hard on how to improve the retention rates, and we'll talk more about it. But I think this is the key message. I think that's what I really wanted to focus on. Ashwin, I think, yeah.
Awesome. I think this is really interesting, Olive. Now, before we actually get to the questions part of it, a couple of quick interesting things, right? So one is both app C and E had the same D30 retention rates of 6%, but you still see that the difference in the monthly performance spend for these two apps is, $1 million versus $832,000, right? So that's really about $200,000 difference. Why is
Right.
that?
That's a very interesting point, actually. So, what happens typically is, while the day 7 or the day 30 retention numbers could be the same for two apps, but the retention on each of the days in between, so it's whether it's D1, D2, D3, or D21. So the difference in the retention of each of those days will ultimately add up. And that's how between C and E, who on paper, it seems like, the 30th retention, the D30 retention is the same for both of them. But when you actually look at the data, you'll see that the retention percentages for these apps on the other days are not same. So app C definitely has better retention in the other days than app E, and hence all those small percentage points finally add up and ends up saving $200,000 at a month level, which is significant, right? So that's
Wow.
the beauty of retention.
Wow. So you're saying that even if we make incremental improvements in our retention rates on a daily basis, it can have a significant impact on our monthly performance spend at the end of 30 days.
That's correct. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Awesome. Awesome. So, one of the questions is basically, how do you explain DAU in your terms?
Sure. So for different businesses, I mean, the definition could be slightly different. For the way I have looked at this, this is essentially anybody who engages with the given app on a particular day. So any particular activity on that app, which means it's primarily the app opens that I'm looking at. One can look at lower funnel metrics also. The fundamentals would remain the same. Of course, the maths will remain the same, but maybe you won't call them as a DAU. Maybe you can call them as an engage DAU. But fundamentally, it's the same thing. So for this simple calculation, I have considered app opens as the metric. We can take any other example or any other particular event. So essentially, this is in an app world, you mostly do the event based tracking and define metrics on certain events. So for me, this is the app opens, and that's how I've defined the DAO.
Awesome. What do you mean by ECPI? I think, I mean, we understand that it's the elasticity of cost per install, but could you kind of elaborate a little bit more around the ECPI concept?
Sure. So it's essentially the cost per installs. Cost per install is typically defined as the dollars that you spend divided by the installs that you drive on the platform. So let's say you're spending money on AdWords or on Facebook or any other channel. So the cost divided by the installs is what is cost per install. The reason why I have considered it as an ECPI, because the daily install numbers or the spends at a daily level could be different. So when you actually add up all the installs and you add up all the daily spends, so the weighted number, so the total cost divided by the total installs, we can call it as a cost per install. I've called it as an effective cost per install. The reason for that being that I could be spending different on different days. So for example, towards the start of the month, I could be spending, I don't know, $10,000 a day, but towards the end of the month, my business has a certain need, and I could be increasing my spends from a $10,000 to a $20,000. So what do I take as the effective cost per install for the entire month? So we take the total cost for the month and with the total volume of installs for the month, and we can divide those two numbers, and we can get the effective cost per install for that particular month.
Got it. I hope that clarifies what an ECPI and what a DAU is. But folks, if you have any other questions, feel free to type in. When you're launching a new product, how do you assume the elasticity for it, right? Are there any ways you can benchmark it? Any thoughts at all on it?
So it's difficult. I mean, if you're so what we can do is we can look at if there are any competitors who are already sort of in the same space, or so we can also look for for example, any other industries where we think that will behave slightly similar to the particular industry that we are in. So we can obviously find some look-alike and and take their benchmark as a best case approximation where we would be. But typically the graph would be it would be like a logarithmic graph. So it would it won't be a linear completely, and it won't be completely an exponential. So depending on so essentially what will happen is, as you spend more and more, the incremental installs will become less and less. So that's how that relationship will typically look like. So I do have a Medium blog on that, so in case you are interested in that, I mean, you can search for Olive Sen and Medium, and you can go through this in a little more details, or and I think that's the best way. But typically the way the graph looks like is, if you, let's say, plot the installs on the y-axis and spends on the x-axis, the way the graph will move is, for every incremental dollar, what will happen is, the installed volume will be less and less. So when you are at a low spend level, you will be getting, let's say, for every $1,000 you would be getting, let's say, X number of installs. But at a higher spend level, for every $1,000 you could be getting X by 2 or X by 3 number of installs, which means that the volume of installs will kind of sort of saturate at a certain level, and that an incremental $1,000 beyond a certain point will not give you those original X number of installs. So that is the assumption that you need to keep in mind. What exactly? So as long as you are not taking the assumption that so at a low spend level, the volume of installs which you are able to drive, and the same volume of installs you will be able to drive at a higher spend level, I think you are safe. The exact relationship is non-linear. You can benchmark with certain assumptions, but I think as long as you are not taking it as a complete linear assumption, you are safe. At least you have accounted for that, that elasticity.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Olive. So, Olive, one interesting thing here is that you're kind of assuming, or we are kind of assuming, that the retention rates for organic installs and paid installs are the same, right? Which usually doesn't happen practically.
Right.
So how will this look? How will this change? The whole calculation, the whole math, how will this change if we start bringing in these additional complexities, right? So for example, different retention rates for different channels, different retention rate for organic versus paid.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Larry, that's typically practically what we will experience, that each individual channel will have its own retention rates, and the funny thing is, those channels will also behave differently at different spend levels. So so the complexity is pretty much there. What we can do is, we can try to just take a simpler view at that what is the cost per DAU, that so what is the cost per DAU if between the different retention levels. So what do I mean by that? So let's say each of these 5 apps, they have 100,000 volume of paid installs, and because each of these apps are spending, let's say, $35,000 daily, and because they're at the same spend level, we can assume for simplicity that the cost per install is also very same. So so 35 cents is what each of these apps are ending up spending. Now the question is, do these apps, when you're looking at a metric like a cost per DAO, so this DAO could be so this is an event based tracking, right? So you can define your own DAO, like you can, depending on which event you want to track for your app, you can define the metric based on that, and you would ultimately want to calculate the cost per that particular event. Now what happens is, let's say for each of these apps, they have different acquisition strategies. They're spending different kind of monies in different paid channels, and that's why their paid retention numbers are different. So what it means, so on the day 0, let's say the app A has 80,000 people coming back, whereas for app D, even the volume of installs is 100,000, only 71,000 are coming back for app D. And similarly, for each of these days, these numbers between A, B, C, D vary because the retention rates on every day for these apps are different. And that could be happening because each of these apps are spending money differently on different channels. So if you don't monitor those trends and you don't see, which channel is effective at what spend level, and how do those retention numbers change for each of those channels when you start spending less, start spending more. So that's why testing, learning, experimenting regularly is so important. What happens because of all of that is the cost per DAO changes significantly. So the cost per DAO, the way I have calculated this number for simplicity is that I have taken the sum of the DAUs over the 6 days. So you can see that the numbers are different for the different apps because this is the activity that I'm seeing on the platform. This is the total number of traffic that I have generated in the last 6 days by spending $35,000. So what is the efficiency that I have got? So I will divide the spend $35,000 divided by the total activity that I have seen on the platform, right? Which is different for the different apps. And I can see that for app D and app B, this number is slightly efficient. So it is only 11 cents, whereas for app E, because of the lower retention, and that could be because app E is spending money on a channel which is having the same cost per install, but not the same paid retention rates. And hence, the activity on the platform is less, and hence my cost per DAU has gone up significantly. So if you compare 11 versus 15, that's almost like 30-40% difference, right? So that is what can happen if we don't spend our monies very intelligently by looking at the numbers. So the metrics that are key to be looked at is retention as well as the cost of acquisition. So both of these numbers, even for a paid channel, will end up having a lot of financial impact. I hope I made sense.
I think that's an excellent. I think that's an excellent table that's there, Olive. I think it kind of really brings out the fact that you don't just optimize for your cost per install, but you actually even look at the retention rate of each of these channels and then try to make decisions on which channel to invest and which channel not to invest on.
Right.
So I think this has been great. So if you were to summarize, Olive, the conversation so far, the top 3 points that you want to summarize so far. Obviously the financial impact of not improving retention rate is fairly obvious. I think the audience would have got the message. It can literally run into hundreds of thousands of dollars every month. But beyond that, if you want to kind of share the top 3 or 4 summaries of what you've spoken so far, what would that be?
Sure. I think so. Just moving on. I think the so it's essentially I mean it's essentially what we're influencing is the the lifetime value. So what we are trying to optimize is that you have a certain budget and you have a certain lifetime value for each user. So how do you efficiently plan your budgets so that you have a profitable business at the end of the day? And we all talk about unit economics, but so these are the calculations which eventually help us to evaluate that in what time frame that we can achieve certain amount of profitability, certain sustained profit margins. So it's trying to link every marketing dollars which is being spent and being spent wisely can lead to a profitable business. The same marketing dollars, if we are not wise enough, sometimes can lead to impacting the lifetime value of your customer and essentially inflating the cost to unsustained levels. So I think that is a crux. I mean, it's relating the business with the marketing that we are doing, and it's very closely related to each other. So I think that's what I think my message would be.
Got it. Awesome. Awesome. And I think there are a couple of questions, but there are a couple of questions, Olive. One is around the customer acquisition part. I mean, we spoke about the cost of customer acquisition. The question is around what are some of your recommendations around the customer acquisition part of it? And there's one more question, which is around how do you actually plug the gaps in the DAU? So how do you actually reduce or control the DAU, the decrease in DAUs?
Sure. So I think I'll take it one by one. So if I talk about customer acquisition, so what we typically look at is, what is the key metric that we are influencing? So for different businesses, it could be different. So just let me give you an example. So for a classifieds business, or for a let's say for a business like OLX, it could be activity on the platform, which is selling and buying used goods. For a food delivery business, it could be orders. For some other platform, like let's say an OTT, it could be video views. So there would be different key metrics for different businesses, right? So typically the way to operate is, you look at the cost of acquisition of that divided for that key metric. So it could be the cost per order, it could be the cost per view, it could be the cost per sell, cost per buy. So identifying that key metric is key, and you want to drive acquisition so that that cost per that particular metric is within the budgeted level. So defining that what is that level that we need to operate is very key, and that would be linked to the business budget that you'd have. So which means that you need X number of orders or X volume of videos to be viewed by users, or Y number of users selling or buying on the platform, and you have a certain marketing budget. So we need to define that what is that cost of acquisition that I can be working under, so that I can meet that business objective. And then once we have defined that, then we need to start testing and experimenting with different channels. That I would not say that there is one golden rule that you spend money here and that's going to drive downloads for you. So you need to experiment for your own business and identify the channels which are working best. What I can advise is what are the metrics to look at. So the metrics to look at, like I said earlier, is cost per install, but also the retention rate for the different channels. So if you look at those numbers regularly, and you keep on experimenting, you will figure out that for what is this optimum spend at a channel level, what is the money that you should be spending at the channel, so that your end goal is not affected by that channel. So defining, so if I just break it down, so defining the metric that you need to optimize on your cost is one step. The second is test enough tests and experiments to identify which channel works best for you. So I think we all know that there are channels like Google, there's channels like Facebook, and there are so many other channels that you can spend your money on. But it's very important to identify which channels are working best for you. So I recommend that you test out those channels with small budgets, identify a window of testing it, define certain attribution parameters, that whether you want to attribute a 30-day window or a 7-day window or a 15-day window for paid channels. You define all those attribution parameters, you define all the tracking, and then ultimately you monitor that what is the cost per install, what is the retention rate for my paid channel, and then you scale it up accordingly. And once you have scaled it up, you will see that certain channels are behaving better, certain channels are not. So it's constant optimization is what keeps you at your desired level. So so that's how you typically do the acquisition part. And Ashwin, if you can just help me recollect the second question.
I think it was around the retention part of it. So when you look at, after you've, basically after you've done the acquisition part, we showed the drop-offs in the DAU. So any tips on how do you plug in those drop-offs in the DAU?
So I think the most, I think we'll talk about it, and how do you reduce churn. So I think typically there are a lot of
I think we can
techniques.
kind of head back to that slide. I think we've got a slide around that.
Yeah, so we can move on there maybe.
Yeah, there you go.
So I think it's essentially identifying where do your users churn and why do they churn. So if you start looking at the data, you will identify that users are dropping off after a certain activity. Users are dropping off after a certain time period, and so there are two ways of handling it. One is fixing the product funnel, fixing the UI and UX part of it and you can do a lot of A/B tests around it to identify what's working, what's not working. And once we have identified some of those challenges, we can it's never going to happen that you'll fix everything in a day and it's going to be 100% increase. So these are all minute, small incremental changes. So for each of those experiments, maybe you will get 5%, 1%, 3% improvements. And ultimately, all of those experiments over a period of 3 to 6 months probably will give you a net increment of 10, 15, 20%. But that's a significant increment that we're talking about. So looking at the data of churn is very important to understand the place and time of churn. The other way, of course, I mean, looking at it, where you can start looking at is, so the users who don't churn, what do they do? So people, you will see that there are certain activities which people do. If the users are doing those activities or those events, then they don't churn. So let's say for OLX, what I have seen is, people who are either selling something or, for example, responding to an ad on OLX. These people have a much longer life cycle than somebody, let's say, who has come onto the OLX platform, seen a few items, and then sort of moved away. So then what I will try to do is I'll try to bring the people who are just browsing to make them sell or make them engage with a particular ad where they actually end up responding, and then thereby I will increase the probability that those people will again come back. So engaging into the core funnels is very important, and first to identify those core funnels. So first step is to identify what are those core engagement activities. Then how can you drive the users into those core engagement activities? So it could be through push notifications, through certain retention frameworks that you could be driving users, or through the product flows, you could be driving users more into those funnels. And then over a period of time, once you have exhausted maybe a lot of options, then the question will be, can you create more such funnels where users engage in and then they don't drop off? So all of these things will eventually help you arrest the drop in DAU, or the gap between the delta between where you need to be and where you are. So I think these are some of the key issues to tackle user churn. And and of course there's like 20 other things which you can do, but in my opinion, I think if you just look at this basic stuff, you will end up fixing a lot of the problems.
Awesome. Excellent. Thank you so much, Olive. So thanks again, Olive. Really appreciate it. It was great having you here and really awesome insights. I hope the audience found it useful.
Thanks, Ashwin. I think I hope these insights are useful to people, and and it helps them solve their real business problems, because I think it's been even enlightening for me. I mean, I've been working in this area for some time, but actually, in the last 1 year, when we were actually tackling these business problems, these are very useful insights for me, and I hope that it helps other people also who are into the similar kind of things to solve their problems. And thanks again for inviting me to speak on this topic. Lovely interacting with all of you, and yeah, stay safe, guys.